Well, everyone, we get to finally talk about another console this time around, which is actually the original Xbox 360. Now, there were several different models of the 360 when it officially came out. We got the 360, 360 Slim, and then we got the Xbox 360e, which most people don't even remember. Now, the Xbox 360 actually ended up selling fairly well for the most part. Eventually, it became, discontinued, and then we got the Xbox One right after. But with something like the Xbox 360, I still think it's a very, very interesting console that Microsoft made, and this was one of the smartest moves from Microsoft. They created so many games and so many titles within this specific genre of games, and it was a really good, price point. It was a really good console, and there were so many other variations of the Xbox 360, including the Elite and all those other models I mentioned as well. Now, this specific console came out in 2005. That was the initial release date. So again, that was about 12 years ago. And the fact that this thing still looks and feels as good as it does, it's actually pretty insane to me. Now, looking on the outside of this console, we had a couple of different variations. Like I said, you had like the black one, you had the white one, you had the arcade models, you had a lot of different models all over the place. But the cool thing about this Xbox was the design. It wasn't a huge console. It was fairly slim and sleek for the most part. Not, like a Nintendo Wii, but it was still a very good looking console that didn't really, kind of seem out of place, which was really, really nice. Now, you had the port selection on the front. So you had two USB ports that you could kind of flop down the front of and kind of slide in there. You had the power button. You had memory card slots on the front. You had a disk drive as well. And just those things in and of itself are really nice to have. Now, the faceplate you could actually remove if you wanted to. So that was another cool thing that you could actually do. You could just pop off the front and put in a different, front-facing plate if you want to. And there were so many skins and so many other things like that for this console that so many people did. And again, I was super happy to see that. Now, on the sides, you don't really have anything. You have the fans and kind of just the exhaust and everything. On the top, you did have the ability of putting in extra storage on the top of this. So you can go ahead and buy extra storage, place it on the top. It was a dedicated slot for extra storage there. So that was another really cool thing. And on the back, you had HDMI ports. You had, I think, the original VGA connectors. You had AC adapter, some other ports there too, which was really cool. And overall, when you look at it on the outside, I still think this console looks fairly good. I don't think it looks dated, but I think most people look at this and I don't know. I feel like when I look at like a Nintendo Wii or even like the original Xbox, I can kind of recognize that more than this thing. I don't know what it is with it, but the Xbox 360 still looks great. It's not an old looking console by any means, but I still think the design is one of those areas that Microsoft kind of improved at, in the later generations. I think the Xbox One S looked beautiful. Definitely one of my most favorite consoles of all time in terms of design. And even the Series S and even the PlayStation 5, I mean, the newest generations we have, all of them look great. But the Xbox 360 looks very, very good as well. Now, the other thing we have to talk about is the controller. Now, the controller of this console, which was that standard, a lot of people look at this controller as one of the best controllers of all time. And I kind of agree. I think this controller looks and feels very, very good. And even in 2022, I think it's just worth picking up just because of this controller in and of itself. Now, you have the two joysticks, one at the top left and one in the middle right, which, I'm perfectly okay with. The Xbox home button on the front. You had the standard buttons on this thing too. And when I look at this thing and when I compare it to even the latest Series S controller, yeah, there are some pros and some cons, but I still think something like the Xbox 360 controller still looks great and it still feels great in my hands. Like I mentioned, a lot of people still look at this controller as one of the best Xbox controllers of all time. You also had the ability of charging it if you bought those rechargeable batteries, and that was a big thing coming from the original Xbox controller. You have to remember, the jump, I believe, from the original Xbox to the Xbox 360 was a way bigger jump from the 360 to the One or from the One to the Series S or X. I believe that original Xbox to the 360, probably one of the biggest differences, at least from what I can tell. Now, booting this thing up, you had the standard Xbox home screen, and there was a lot of features built into this specific console in and of itself. Now, there were a few different variations of this console. The specific one I had did not have Wi-Fi built in, so I had to either plug it into the back or get some sort of like smart link adapter to get this thing working with Wi-Fi. I don't think it was a big deal, but it is kind of an inconvenience when there were other consoles of that time that actually had Wi-Fi built in. But getting this thing to turn on and downloading games and just being immersed in the ecosystem with Xbox Live, this was one of the coolest things that Microsoft did at this point. And there were other developers and other manufacturers who were also utilizing Wi-Fi and all those other things. But the fact that Microsoft, this, the company that made Windows and, all these other things tapped into the gaming market and were able to make such a beautiful console with so much power within it. It actually screamed out to me that Microsoft was going to be here for a long period of time, and they still are. Now with this Xbox 360, the gaming library is absolutely awesome. There were so many features with this specific console. I mean, you could play those amazing games, you could play online, you could go ahead and, utilize all these cool graphics, you could go ahead and download games online as well. You could access so many different things, you can play online with your friends. There were so many cool things involved with this specific console that really took it from a standardized console that, you could play locally with your friends to a full media experience, which is so cool. And that's not even tapping all those extra features that Microsoft built in here that kind of made it feel like almost like a PC in a way. There was more that meets the eye with this specific console, which was really cool. Now on top of that, like I mentioned, there were iterations of this console. So since then we got the Xbox 360 Slim and the 360e. Now I believe the Slim is probably my favorite 360 just because it looked so great, but every single one of these Xboxes for the most part had some sort of issue and controversy. Towards the end of it, meaning with the E lineup, it was kind of refined for the most part. But you have to remember, you can't talk about the Xbox 360 without mentioning the Red Ring of Death, and this was a pretty big issue. So essentially what would happen was, I don't even know, there was like some thermal problems within the 360, and almost every single Xbox 360 I had a few of them, they actually all had the Red Ring of Death, which was so crazy. And what happened was the fans, I don't even know what happened, but basically you couldn't even use your console if you saw the red lights come up. And this was a crazy big issue. I'm not too sure why this ended up happening, and I'm not too sure if Microsoft ended up releasing a fix for this thing, but because the Xbox 360 sold so well, there were so many people who had issues with this. Even if it was like a small amount percentage-wise, there were still a ton of people who had this issue. So I say that to say, when I look back at the Xbox 360, it is at a very, very interesting spot, because on one hand, it sold very well. There was, several iterations of this console. The gaming library of this console was, very good as well. But then you look at some of the complaints, you look at the Red Ring of Death, and even though I think the PlayStation 3's had the yellow light of death, it's still very insane that a console like this, developed by a company who is known for their software and hardware like Microsoft, could end up dropping something like this that had this big of an issue. Now I do think since then, we had the Xbox Ones, we had the Series S, and they all had their own problems. But when I look back at this console, and especially when it affected me, like with the red light of death, I'm surprised that the newest consoles don't have crazy big issues like this. There are still some problems here and there. There's some like stuttering, glitchy frames and all this other stuff. But when I look at the Xbox 360, I'm actually pretty surprised how decent of a console this thing was, and how great of a job Microsoft did. And especially now, I'm, kind of happy about the consoles nowadays that we don't have crazy big problems like this. And if there was another problem like this, I'm sure the company would step up and probably do something about it. So I think the 360 is still awesome. It's a cool piece of technology, and I just love looking at this thing. It's such a beautiful console, and I love the history with this console as well. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.